We are interested in how different types of background noise can impact on a person's speech perception. Informational interference, which is the interference caused by the information in someone's speech, is poorly understood in comparison to energetic masking, which includes transport noise, bangs, and crashes. This is because it is difficult to manipulate informational interference without altering energetic masking. In this study, we aim to isolate one possible way in which informational interference may arise, through knowledge of the language of competing talkers. We are also interested in how a listener's ability to control informational interference changes over time. We hypothesized that listeners with knowledge of the background talker's language would experience informational interference, but that informational interference will decrease over time as listeners become better at segregating talkers. We predicted that listeners with knowledge of competing talkers' language will have worse performance relative to listeners with no knowledge of the background language. We also predicted that listeners will improve in their task performance over time, and that all listeners will improve faster in unknown language background speech than known language background speech. This study has 3 experiments, with listeners undertaking the same transcription task in all experiments. Experiment 1 was we had 32 native English listeners listening to English target sentences. Experiment 2, we had 30 native Mandarin, non-native English listeners listening to English target sentences. And experiment 3, we had 48 native Mandarin, non-native English listeners listening to Mandarin target sentences. Using generalized linear mixed effects models, we found that listeners improved in speech and noise transcription over time in all experiments. However, there were differences in changes in release from masking between masker speech and masker time reverse speech between experiments. In experiment 1, listeners experienced a reduction in informational interference over time, whereas in experiment 2, listeners experienced no change in informational interference over time. In experiment 3, listeners experienced different changes in release from masking, with a decrease in informational interference in the English language conditions over time, and an increase in the informational interference in the Mandarin language conditions over time. To summarize, we find decreases in release from linguistic masking with known task-irrelevant languages, but increases in release from masking with known task-relevant languages.